Hey, everybody, we're back with another episode of Roasa Law Group's podcast. Hope everybody's doing good here. We're just coming off the weekend ourselves. Lance, how's everything going on your end?
Doing great, Steve. Staying busy, all the fun stuff.
Yeah, I hear that. I told myself this weekend I was going to check my emails. I was going to get ahead of myself. I'm right here on Monday morning and I'm already running behind. So
It is Monday
just the way it
morning.
goes. So today we're going to be talking about another topic in the long list of employment contract terms. We're going to talk about term termination, what is at will, things of that nature. So like one of the things like I'm going to lead off with is a lot of people come to us and say, well, my state's an at will state, so I don't need to really worry about anything in this whole termination section of my contract, right? Right, Lance? I don't have to worry about that.
Well, honestly, Steve, let's take a step back first. This is probably one of the least boring topics for veterinary students and veterinarians. And we get it. This one's not too exciting at all. But here's the deal, of all the people that call our office looking for guidance on how to get out of their contract, and that's probably 50% of the employment calls that we get, are people wanting to leave their employment, 50% getting in, 50%, getting out approximately. But of all the people that call, this is the big deal. And so this is one of those situations where it's pretty boring and it's not a big deal until it's a big deal. And when it's a big deal, it causes a lot of consternation for everyone. And Steve, you nailed it, right? I mean, so that is by far one of the most common myths that I hear is this myth of my state's an at-will state, so none of this really matters in the first place. And this comes from veterinarians that have been employers for 35 years. Where our employers are even messing this up, sometimes and fall into the trap. And so I have to go, we both have to go to great lengths to explain what is an at-will state and how does that interact with our veterinary contract and what does that mean when we need to terminate employment and get out of employment. And so the first thing that I'll say, Steve, is the at-will status of the state is the baseline. It is the default. It's the backstop. The parties, employer and employee, can always contract around the default status. And so, let's say the legislature of the state of Texas has decided that Texas is an at-will state, which is true, by the way. But what that means is the state legislature has voted to say, if the parties don't talk about this, if the parties don't talk about ending employment, then this is what we're going to imply that the parties wanted at will status. But the parties can talk about it and they can always contract around that default status. And so if there's a writing, if the parties have talked about it in the form of a contract, if there's a writing, then that prevails over the top of whatever the state legislature has decided. And guess what? Probably 95% of veterinary employment at this point has a written contract. So the parties are talking about it. And this is one of those big situations where this is another way that employers can lock employees in to employment. We're living in a white hot job market and it's hard to find employees. And once you get a veterinarian, you want them to stay there. You want them to be locked in. So we talked about other ways that employers lock in employees. For example, the non-competes. We've talked about that already. Signing bonus repayment provisions. We talked about that already. Well, those are kind of like, one way to lock in. This is a third way to lock people in by contracting around that at-will status and putting a term contract in place. And so when we see these contracts and people say, "Hey, help me get out of this contract," well, if it's already signed and we've got a term contract, that's a huge problem for that employee.
Yeah, and I look at it like this way when I'm talking to clients and I'm saying, look, think about all the jobs that don't have a contract. They're going to default to the state's status, but think about, you, a veterinarian, a sports player. You've got a 4-year contract now. You're not going to go sign, a sports player for a 60 million 4-year contract, and then they say, you know what, I don't like this team after all. I'm out.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, I'm just gonna move. I'm gonna move elsewhere. I'm gonna take my services elsewhere. It's funny you say sports player, Steve. I say football coach. And so when we're
Yeah.
defining what a what a term contract is, I call that the football player's contract. Definitely a sports player's contract as well. And so let's stop for a second and define those terms. And so when we say the words at will employment or an at will contract, that means that either party can terminate at any reason for any time during the employment. And so it's kind of at will. It's come and go as you please. And that's what most employers and employees want. Most veterinarians and veterinary employers don't want to lock people in. Some do, but some don't. Now, that's juxtaposed against what you said, Steve, a football player or a sports player's contract. That is a term contract. Saquon has signed a contract that says that he will work and play for the Eagles for 4 years, which means that, and God forbid, Steve, he couldn't say, 2 years in, I'm just not too excited about the Eagles anymore. I think I'm going to go to the Pats and play. That he can't do that because he is locked into a 4 year contract through a term contract. That's what the lawyers have negotiated, for millions of dollars and all of that fun stuff. And that's opposed to at will employment, where Saquon could say, hey, it's been fun, it's been real. I think I'm going to move and go play for the Patriots moving forward. That would allow him to do that in an at will under an at will contract in an at will state, obviously. And so whether you're talking about football coaches, whether you're talking about, professional athletes, that's the term contract. Now, relate that to veterinary medicine. Some of the contracts we see, it's not very many. It's 5%, 7%, something like that, that says that you will work for this practice for a certain term, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years term. And no matter what happens, this is implied, no matter what happens, you have to continue to work for this practice. And so we always play the what ifs game. What if life happens? What if, your family member gets sick and you've got to move back closer to home? What happens if you break your leg and you can't work anymore? What happens if a tornado hits the practice and it's no longer there? Well, you've
Yeah.
promised to continue to work there, regardless the reason of termination. You promised to continue to work there.
I mean, what happens if your spouse gets a really, really much better job and you're going to relocate? Spouse goes without you.
Yeah, yeah. It says that you are locked in. And what is the, what's the stick? What's the problem on the other side of that? Well, the on the other side of that is a lawsuit for breach of contract. So if Saquon leaves the Eagles and goes to the Patriots 2 years into his contract, he's going to be sued for breach of contract. If a veterinarian that's under a term contract leaves their contract, leaves their employment early before that term is over, then they are sued for breach of contract. And these are unfortunately relatively common cases. Just the threat of the case, the intimidation of the case is the big deal, right? And so practices don't have a problem at all suing an employee for breach of contract.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm thinking like if I'm in a term length contract, I want to have a way out if life happens.
Yep.
That's absolutely necessary. Is yeah, I get it. I want to be here for a certain term, hopefully 1 year at a time and not more than that. We'll discuss why not more than that in a bit, but what do I do to get I need a way out. I can't just say like because again, life is going to happen whether we want it to or not.
Yeah, that's our job as legal advisors, and somebody that's looking at these contracts is we always have to play the what if game. What happens if something bad happens? And so the way that, and this is why this is so confusing, Steve, is the way this happens is most of these contracts do have a term in them. They will say this contract is good for a year, from the effective date, or it'll put dates, July 1st to July, 1 year, July 1st to the next year. It will say it's good for 12 continuous months. So there creates the term. And so you read the first paragraph, it says there's a term. But under at will employment, there's a line somewhere in that contract that says the parties may terminate this agreement at any time with or without reason, subject to 30 days, 60 days, 90 days notice. That is your at will line. And so the way that I kind of equate this, Steve, is All veterinarians are subject to first year anatomy. And so you go into this anatomy lab and it's got all these cadavers, and the cadavers are obviously soaked in formaldehyde, and it stinks, and your clothes stink, all day afterwards, and it's not very much fun. But in that lab, we have to go through and find all the little nerves and vessels on that cadaver. Sometimes when you're looking at that cadaver, you know that that nerve is there somewhere. I mean, it's like it's got to be there. It's just hard to find. That's how I equate finding these at will sentences sometimes. It's got to be in there. All right, let's go find it. I don't know what paragraph it's going to be in. I don't know what heading it's going to be in, but I've got to go. I have to find that agreement. So it's very rare that I have lines in the sand, Steve. You know this, right? I tell, I tell clients, hey, I'm going to warn you of all the things. We're going to talk about all the things. But at the end of the day, it's your life to sign. This is the one thing where I draw a line in the sand and say, you cannot sign an employment agreement that doesn't have a way out. You
Yep.
cannot sign an employment agreement that doesn't have an at-will termination provision. I just got to go find it, right? And so we start with there's a term contract, but it's subject to the termination provisions in what we just talked about, the at-will termination provision. And then it's also subject to, Steve, and I kind of said these words but didn't explain them, to the notice period. And so most contracts that we're seeing at this point are 60 days notice.
Yep.
But what else are you seeing, Steve?
Well, I'm seeing I do see 90 for specialists, somewhat typically, 60 for GP. Sometimes we'll see 30 for GP as well. We also sometimes see the onerous 120,
Yeah.
180. And this is where I start to get my hackles up and say, I have to know 6 months in advance. And then how's that 6 months gonna play out where I don't want to be there and I don't want to be there. And yeah, it becomes a difficult situation. What I'm also seeing is a distinct lack of fairness at times, whereas associate is required to give 60 days notice, practice is required to give 0 days notice. And that's
Yeah.
where we don't want to be. We want to be, we're striving for fairness here.
Yeah, so it's a couple of things to unpack there, Steve. And so if we're seeing, and by let's back up a sec. So 5 years ago, 10 years ago, by far the norm was 30 days notice. And so if you're an associate, you have to give 30 days notice. We can back up a couple of decades, and the notice period was really a handshake and 2 weeks notice. That 2 weeks thing is kind of like professional courtesy, right? As a technician, as an assistant, as a receptionist, you don't really want to leave a job with zero notice. You give your employer 2 weeks notice, as a quote unquote professional courtesy. All right. So then in veterinary contracts, it was expanded to 4 weeks, 30 days, where you had to give 30 days. But what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is definitely this expansion to 60 days and 90 days. And you mentioned it, Steve. This is one of the things I wanted to unpack. When you start to get 120 or 180-day notice period, well, that looks a lot like a term contract. And
Right.
here's the problem with that is if you break that promise to give 180 days notice, then the practice has a lawsuit for breach of contract. And under the damages of that lawsuit for breach of contract, there's two things. The replacement value of you as a veterinarian. So the practice goes out and hires a relief veterinarian, which are very expensive. So that would be one. They multiply how many relief days do we have to hire? And that would be the damages that they sue their former employee for. Or B, the lost profits that employee would have brought in. And so here we have thousands of dollars per day in damages. And all of a sudden that 180-day notice equates to a lawsuit for two or $300,000. And secondly, Steve, what you were referring to is really the intimidation or the deterrent factor, where the practice is saying, hey, you have to give us 120, 180 days notice because that's what's in the contract. That's what you signed. So anytime you get past, say, 90 days, Steve, I'm with you. I start to get really concerned. And that really comes from one of the other things that you said is once you put in your notice, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or 180 days, they know you don't want to be there. Everybody's treated differently. I mean, it's kind of like you're the lame duck president, right? Like it's like they put you, in the lower the lower rooms and put you on the worst responsibilities and the worst schedule. People give you the cold shoulder, even up to, like a hostile, work environment. And so that last 60, 90, 120, 180 days before your notice is miserable. And so for all of those reasons, we want to get it as short as we possibly can, right? That you're not locked into that job any longer than you have to be.
That's the worst part of my day is when I have to get on the phone with somebody and say, I'm really, really sorry. You got to go put in your 180 days notice.
Yeah. Which
Start
never
and
should have
start.
been
Yeah.
never should have been signed in the first place. It
No.
looks a lot like a term
Yeah.
contract, and if we break it, and we can almost expect to get a nasty letter from the practices legal team to say, if you do this, then we're going to sue you for breach of contract, and this is what the damages are going to be. So there, it's a serious thing here, and this becomes kind of like a stick, a mallet, right? We're going to beat you back into submission, and you're going to keep seeing those rooms. And that's another thing that we really need to talk about is both of us have been doing this for a long time. Steve, you've been doing this for 20 years, and so 10 years ago, if a veterinarian put in their notice and said, "Hey, I'm giving you my 30-day notice," there's about a 50% chance that the practice is going to say, "Hey, thanks. You don't have to finish the rest of your shifts. You don't have to finish out your time. We'll pay you for that. We're going to make good on that, but you can go away." Sometimes they'll actually negotiate and say, "We're not going to pay you for that. Let's just shake hands and just, if you're not happy, we don't want you here." And there's a couple of reasons for that. Is we don't want somebody that doesn't want to be there in our hospital. And the second thing is we don't want somebody in our hospital that's continuing to meet and talk to clients. And so this gives them ample opportunity to compete, possibly unfairly, under the non-solicitation agreement. And so it's like, hey, this person doesn't want to be here. They're still receiving private information. Get them out of the practice as fast as we can. 10 years ago, that was the norm. Steve, at this point, when's the last time you've seen an employer do that?
No, it doesn't happen anymore. I mean, and you're right. It was like the whole thing was, look, if you don't want to be here, we don't want you here. We want people here that want to be here. Not anymore.
Yep.
No, no, you're going to work out to the bitter end of your notice period. You're going to tread lightly. You're going to just fly under the radar as much as possible. And then hopefully you're going to get out the door without getting scathed by anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason for that is practices. Again, it's a white hot job market. Practices just want people to fill those shifts. And so it doesn't matter if you're unhappy, if you're miserable, if your emotional and mental health is in the drain. It doesn't matter that your parents, you've got a parent that's sick 3 states away and you need to leave now. They're like, hey, you're here and you're working and you're going to fill those shifts, until we say otherwise. And so you can expect practices at this point to uphold and to require that notice period. And
It
you kind
does
of know, go ahead, Steve.
it doesn't even matter if like they know you're not going to generate the revenue you're capable of. You're still going to generate enough that it's more worthwhile than hiring a relief doctor.
Yeah, yeah. Come in and at least see the appointments you're scheduled for, and all of that. And you kind of said it earlier, that we see these quite often that are what I call bilateral, meaning that the employer's notice is not the same as the employee's notice. And so, like you said, Steve, these don't have to be bilateral. It's anything that the parties want to contract to. So the employer that wrote the contract, they never want to lock themselves into anything longer than they have to. And so they'll put anywhere from 0 to 30 days. We will give you 0 to 30 days notice if we're going to terminate you, the employee, at will. But you've got to give us 90 days, 120 days, 100 and 180 days. And so one of the biggest negotiation pieces is to get these, two the bilateral termination provisions into alignment. All right, hey, if you're going to give me 30 days, then I'm going to give you 30 days. If you're going to force me to give 60 days, then I'm going to need 60 days from you. Because what ends up happening is that if they terminate you for non-performance issues, economic issues, as in lay you off, then you get that pay for 30 days or 60 days, or whatever the situation is. And so it doesn't leave a veterinarian out on the street basically scrambling to find, a new job.
Well,
And so big negotiation, on over these two, what seem like kind of arcane and not very, important things. But go ahead, Steve.
we'll even see things like the really ones that get trickier. We'll see ones that say employer will try to give 60 days
Yeah.
notice, but you're required to associate.
Yeah. There's a big corporate out there. I know this is going to crack you up, Steve, but it says the employer will endeavor to provide. When,
We'll
endeavor
try.
is
We'll
yeah, we'll
try.
try. We'll give the old college try, but we probably won't be able to. That's one of those things where we can get that one changed almost every time.
Mhm.
You just have to point it out and say, well, that's not legal language.
Yeah, wait
But
a
the
minute.
employee is required to give, fully legally required to give this notice. So why isn't the employer required to give that legal
Right.
notice?
Right. And it's like, oh, really? Oh, sorry. Our bad. We'll fix
Yeah.
it for you.
Yeah, well, they'll take that word require or endeavor and change it to require, pretty quickly. And so this brings up another kind of topic, Steve. So we're up until now, we've been talking about at will termination. So again, it's the parties will, can terminate employment at any time, at any reason, or no reason at all, right? And so they can just say, "Hey, we're done with each other. Thank you very much." Everybody moves on to your new thing. Other contracts will just come out and call it and say this is at will employment, and so meaning that the state law default is supposed to be upheld. That by all the other connotations that under the definition of at will, it's any time for any reason. So the language is always a little bit different, but we're looking for something along those lines: anytime, any reason, or at will employment. Again, that has to be in the contract. Now now when we're talking about it, from an employer's perspective or even employees too, that is the at will notice. All right. On the other end of that is for cause termination. And so when we're talking about for cause termination, there we have to point to a reason, right? We have to say, because the employee embezzled, because of the employee was convicted of a felony, because the employee, lost their veterinary license. Right? These are reasons for cause termination, right? There was a cause of the termination versus there was no cause of the termination. And so we have to split out those two reasons for termination when we're looking at these things. And so it depends on how the employee is terminated by the practice. Were they terminated for cause or were they terminated at will? And when it comes to for cause termination, that's usually effective immediately, right? So if you embezzled from the practice, they don't want you in the practice anymore. If you lost your veterinary license, there's not a lot that you can do, and so they don't want you in the practice anymore. Effective immediately. And so this is how I kind of illustrate this out, Steve. All right. So when a practice goes to terminate an employee, and this goes for any employer, honestly, if it's a at will termination, for any reason, no reason at all. It's, hey Bob, it's been good. It's been a good run, but we just can't keep you here anymore. The economy has taken a downturn, or we just can't afford your salary anymore. And we're so sorry, Bob, but we're pursuant to the contract. We're giving you 30 days notice. We're going to pay you out those 30 days. But after that, your employment's terminated. I really appreciate the effort and the work that you put into this company. We wish you the very, very best in the future. All right, that would be an at will termination. No, I mean there was essentially no reason at all. It was an economic reason, which was outside of the employee's control. That is opposed to a for cause termination, which looks like this, Steve. And so, Bob, you have been found guilty, and we have the videotape evidence that says that you embezzled cash out of the practice cash drawer. We are terminating your employment effective immediately. I want you to get all your stuff, put it in a cardboard box. I'm going to escort you to the front door right now, Bob. Your employment is over immediately, and we'll be, doing whatever, legally because of that. And so notice the difference between those two sets of languages overall. That's a difference between at will and for cause termination. It can also happen on the employee side as well, Steve. And so we actually see a few contracts that have for cause termination by the employee. And so if the practice doesn't meet a certain set of standards, if the practice doesn't have a set of technicians, for specialists, if the practice doesn't have specialized equipment that they need to do their work. The ones that come to mind are the ophthalmologists that need a phaco machine, right? And so if the practice doesn't get a phaco machine, then the contract can be terminated by the employee, by the specialist for cause, which is a whole different set of
Mm-hmm.
things moving consequences basically moving down the line there. And so it doesn't have to be just on the employer's side. The employee can have for cause termination as well, which may not have any notice at all.
Yeah, and Lance, I'm gonna ask you a question in a second here, but like when I'm looking at an agreement and I'm like, I'm like it's and it doesn't have the explicit at will statement. If your agreement has a start date, but it doesn't have an end date, it's at will employment. Your employment will start on X date and does not end until terminated under section blank.
Yeah, I always laugh at those a little bit, Steve, because those are perpetual agreements. I mean, they run for, until the end of time,
So you retire or get fired.
until the sun stops shining, right?
Yeah.
And so someone has to, to act to put in termination. So earlier I said most of these contracts are for a year. That's what we would vastly prefer, right? So it's a 1 year employment contract with the at-will termination language. But some of them go forever, right? Until the employee or the employer puts in the notice that's required. Now, the reason, and I'm going to throw another caveat in there as well, some of them are for 1 year, but they automatically extend. And I know this is a, as we say in Texas, Steve, this is a burr under your saddle pad. You don't
Yep.
like those automatic extensions,
No.
at all, because and go and tell me what's your problem with that?
Yeah, so like if I'm on a 1 year contract and my contract automatically renews at the end of the 1 year term, and I'm that happens, well, guess what? I'm now stuck at the same terms for another year. I didn't get any chance to renegotiate. Maybe I wanted a higher salary. Maybe I wanted another week of vacation. Now I've lost all my negotiating power if I even go to the employer and say, "Hey, we didn't have a performance review. I didn't get to ask for what I wanted. Why aren't I? Why can't I have you change my contract now?" And they can say, "Well, look, your contract automatically renewed. We're at these terms for another year."
Yeah, yeah. Well, Steve and I have managed veterinary practices in the past, and we know how busy, practices, can get. And so basically, it's a round to it, situation. It's like, hey, can we talk about my contract? Oh yeah, yeah, we'll get around to it when we get when we slow down a little bit. Or hey, after we get through this season, we'll talk about it. And it just keeps getting kicked back, right? Because the employer knows that the employee is going to ask for more money. And so it's like, oh, I'm busy, we're busy. Let's do it. Let's do it next week. Let's do it next week, and it just keeps getting pushed back. The termination of the contract is a good kind of motivation, like a date that says, "Hey, we have got to get this negotiated before we run out of this contract. Before this contract needs renewal, we have to sit down and talk about these things." And that automatic extension basically provides an unlimited amount of extensions, to push this thing back where we want a hard stop on the contract, so that forces the employer employee to sit down and renegotiate for the new year.
Yeah, yeah. The automatic renewal, it definitely gets me. And well, what and here's another one I was thinking about, Lance. Sometimes you'll see these agreements. They'll say, "Hey, it's an at-will employment contract. Either party can terminate at any time for any reason, no notice, any notice." And then, like on page 10 of the contract, it's like, "But you got to give 60-day notice, really."
Yeah. So it's one of those deals where you've got to read the whole contract through and through, like I talked about earlier, find that nerve, find the little thing that we're looking for. Sometimes they can be contradictory, like you're talking about, and that notice period is going to prevail there, right? And so it's going to require that notice period is going to be the requirement, of that. And so, let's go back to that perpetual agreement, Steve, or that
Yeah.
automatic extension agreement. Let's say that you try to negotiate and you can't get it out. What's your next step? What do you if the employer is like absolutely not, we're not taking out that automatic extension. What do you insert in there in the meantime?
Yeah, I want to see something that lets me gives me a performance review at a certain time, absolutely guaranteed, no mistaking it. Because here's the thing, how often does your employer come up to you near the end of your contract and say, "Hey, what do you want? You want to raise? You want more benefits? What can we give you?" It's just no,
Yep.
no.
Yeah.
We need a meeting point
Yep.
if you're
Yeah.
gonna have this.
So we'll mandate a performance review. So we'll say the parties will meet and and the employer will give a performance review. And at that time, hopefully and ideally, the employer sits down and says, "Hey, everything's great. Staff love you, staffs loves you, the pets love you, animals love you, the team loves you, everything, your medicine is great, everything is going well." And that gives the employee the opportunity to say, okay, well, how about a raise? How about more PTO? How about more benefits? How about more days in surgery? I mean, so it gives them an opportunity to open that dialogue. And that's what we're really, looking for. It's not that we want our clients and employees to be subject to a negative employment review. We're kind of assuming that everything's going well, at that point where they will mandate and sit down. And it's not that there's going to be a lawsuit over a performance review. We know that, right? But we want something in the contract that says that the employee can point to and say, "Hey, remember, this was really important to me. I inserted this change in the contract, and it's important to me that I sit down and I get this performance review. I want to know how I'm doing. I want to know how I can improve. I need that feedback. Can we sit down and have this?" And it's an important enough that it's in the contract, right? Something that we can point to that was promised.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Steve, I'm going to throw one layer of complexity in here, which in an already complex world here, and that is the contract that we see that says that the employee can give notice 60 days prior to the end of the term, right? And so what we see in clients, employees, veterinarians get confused by this. They'll see that 60 days notice and they'll say, "Oh, sweet, I've got what these guys are talking about. I've got that notice period. It's 60 days, but there's a difference."
Yeah.
On one, it says, prior what we were talking about earlier, we say the employee can give 60 days notice at any time for any reason. The any time is the important part, right?
Mhm.
This one says the employee can give 60 days notice prior to the end of the term. So basically, if it's a 1 year contract, the employee has to wait for 10 months. So there's really one little window that they can provide their notice in, and they have to wait until that window comes open to give their notice to leave the practice. And what are you seeing with that, Steve?
Yeah, and then they're still having to work the whole term because you're giving your 60-day notice at 10 months. You got 2 more months to go. You're at 12 months. And yeah, now you're out of your contract, but you are absolutely stuck. And that's now they can, and then the practice knows this. They know they want to get you for 1 year. They're gonna and that's what they're doing, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, this is not
It's
by
it's a
accident.
trick.
These are the big, well, a lot of the big corporates use this little smoke and mirror show, where they know there or they think that the veterinarian's not going to read the entire contract, and if they do, they're not going to catch this very little subtlety. And when the veterinarian goes to put in their notice, they're like, "Oh, gotcha," and,
Yeah.
and this is a game of gotcha
And
over.
now, and in that case, now the veterinarian may have tipped their hand at 5 months in that they're ready to leave. And now they're in that same position that we talked about when you're giving your 180 days notice and not having a fun next 6 months.
Yep. Yep. It tipped your hand, got slapped back by the legal department, back to work for, whatever it is, 4, 5, 6 months,
Yep.
back to misery, and then now it's, everybody knows that you're planning on,
Yeah.
leaving. And so these are all things that we definitely have to talk through before signing the agreement. This is probably one of the more frustrating, not fun parts of our job, is to review that contract and say, "We don't have good news for you. You signed this a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and this is the law. This is how it's going to be upheld. These are the potential damages." and we're going to try to find some ways to work around it. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. We
Right.
would much rather have this conversation before signing the contract. So it's, oh, hey, wait, you got this thing about 60 days prior to the end of the term. Let's get that language corrected. Or, hey, you're not doing this 120, 180-day notice thing. Let's get that back to an industry standard 60 or 90. Let's
Yep.
negotiate this properly before signing it versus after signing it.
Yeah, because it's just really a bummer to have to say, I'm sorry, you can't really go take your dream job. You're stuck there
Mhm.
for another 6 months. Maybe we can negotiate or maybe we can settle it. But if the owner is going to adamantly make you stick to that notice period, hopefully the other job will wait around for you because
Yeah,
it's really not the situation we want to be in.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve, that most people come to us. They've already found the new job, and the new job's like, "Hey, what about your old job?" And they say, "Well, let's run it by a lawyer and have a look." And we got to deliver the bad news. And it's very rare that an employer would want to wait for 5 or 6 or 7 months to bring that new person on. They got a job posting because they need somebody now. Not 6 months, from now, overall. And so there's one last confusing thing that I want to talk about here, Steve. And so
Sure.
because there's all these dates that are floating out there, right? So on one hand, we've got this term date. Okay, the contract will run for 1 year, which is the vast majority. We really push back on people that want to sign a 3 year or 5 year contract. That's not industry normal. That's not standard. 1 year by far is standard. All right, so we've got that date. And then we've got the 60 days notice date, right? We want that to be at will notice, right? 30, 60, whatever days, that it is. But then also, which we haven't brought up in this conversation at all, is we've got the signing bonus repayment term. And I want to point out that all of these are completely independent of each other, right? And so we might have a contract that's for 1 year, but we have a signing bonus repayment provision that's for 2 or 3 years. So what
Yeah.
that means is you can terminate employment at the 6 month mark, at the 1 year mark, and
Yeah.
all that has to happen is you have to pay back a portion. Hopefully, we got it prorated, a portion of that signing bonus. That those are independent things. All right. And so, because if you don't have the term contract, the other end of the spectrum happens, the practice has the right to sue you. And so they sue you for breach of contract. So those are two different things. And the way that I kind of think about it is on one hand, we've got the carrot. You got the old stick and carrot approach, right? And so the signing bonus repayment provision or a for or a retention bonus is a carrot, right? We want you to stick around because of this carrot. All right. On the other hand is this stick, right? If you leave, we're going to sue you. And so those are two tools that the employer can use to ensure that the veterinarian sticks around, right? And so whether we call these traps or red flags or whatever we want to call it, these are things that are problematic and detrimental to the employee. And so those are things that we need to watch out for in the employment contracts.
It's easily conflated. Many people have said to me, "Oh, hey, I have a 2 year contract," and it's no, no. You have a 2 year repayment term on your signing bonus. The contract is at will.
Mhm. Yep. Completely independent. It's hard to keep all these dates straight, but they set forth different actions under different lawsuits, overall. And so, I mean, the bottom line here, Steve, is these are not for the naive or the unknowing. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was a handshake. Hey, you're going to work for me, I'm going to pay you, and everything's going to be good, and we know each other, and we look each other's in the other in the eye, and I'm going to give you professional courtesy if I decide to go to the next job. There's no, real fear of lawsuits and things along those lines. But as veterinary medicine has become more complex and the employers are more complex and sophisticated, they're private equity firms and venture capital firms, or at least very well managed practices with good lawyers, then these employment contracts have become more complex. The money is bigger, right? The ability to hire is harder, and so all of this points to these becoming not for the naive. Here's the cool thing, Steve. You kind of mentioned it earlier, but as soon as the employee points this out in the contract, the vast majority of the time, 75, 80% of the time, when we see one of these term issues, one of these termination issues, the employer's like, oh, so sorry, my bad. Let me correct that, which tells us that they're trying to set a trap for the naive, right? They're if they're willing to negotiate it, they know what's in there. If they're willing to negotiate it, that just means that they're trying to pull a fast one, by the employee, and they're assuming and hoping that the veterinarian employee didn't read the contract fully, didn't, didn't read it, didn't understand it, and they didn't get legal advice before signing it. And so they've got that gotcha moment, at the end. So, our strong preference, and obviously we're biased, Steve, is, employees, veterinarians really should call an attorney before signing one of these. The stakes are too high. This is not a DIY situation.
No, and you would think something as simple as perm and termination would not fall into that category. And 10 years ago, we certainly wouldn't have been able to do a whole podcast about it. But that
Yeah.
shows you times have certainly changed in that regard.
Yeah, yeah, and unfortunately on my end, I'm the guy that has to handle the lawsuits, over this, and I can think of dozens of threatened or actual lawsuits that happened over this same thing. And so, for things to be threatened or to go to an actual lawsuit, that's really bad. The big ticket item about this is the deterrent or the intimidation factor, right? This is what I signed. This is what the law is. This is what I'm going to have to uphold. And I'm going to have to work out that 120 or 180-day notice period, regardless of my mental health, regardless of my family status, regardless of this other job that's waiting, this opportunity that I'm going to miss out on. And so these do a lot of damage to employees that aren't really looking downstream of, hey, this is what's going to happen with my life, or this is what could happen. We can leave lawsuits off the table.
Yeah.
It's all the underlying things that cause the intimidation or the deterrent that keep employees into these positions.
Yeah, and now y'all out there know, I mean, even if it's, the number one item in most of the agreements is going to be your term. Don't just breeze right over it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, very boring item at first glance, right? And so, I'm sure that for veterinary students, that small bowel diarrhea is more exciting, but it's not a problem until it's a problem, right? And so when we get
Yep.
those phone calls that say, "I need out of this contract," this is exactly what we're looking at.
Well, Lance, we haven't. I think we've kind of touched on everything and shared our horror stories and what to do to prevent said horror stories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So just to summarize here, most contracts are for term, but they're subject to an at-will notice period, and that at-will notice period has some sort of definition in it: 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, something along those lines. Um, for term, like true term contracts are bad for veterinarians. We don't want a term contract for a veterinarian. We have to have some way out. Your signing bonus repayment provision is different. This is two independent things from the actual term of the contract and the at-will notice of the contract. And then the last thing overall is this concept of the state's at-will status, right? Which is the default, behind the scenes backstop if there's not something in the contract. So the contract is going to override and overrule the default provisions that the state is an at-will state. So these are all, we're trying to play Mythbusters here, and bust up these myths and common misconceptions. But yeah, that's your quick down and dirty summary of what term and termination looks like in veterinary employment contracts.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Remember, if it's a handshake deal, you're an at-will employee.
There you go, Steve. All right, see you next time.